Right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Cassandra Lunch number 52. We have finally hit that 52-week mark. We have been doing these for a little over a year now, but now it is official. We have a year's worth of Cassandra Lunch content on the books. Today, we will be covering Airflow and Cassandra, cluster management, presented by Obi, one of the software engineers here at Anant. The organizers here for Cassandra Lunch started with Raul Singh. Arpan and myself have now also kind of taken over that role a little bit. So this is my second introduction, you guys, so bear with me. Let's see, so we are looking for other co-organizers if that's something you're interested in. Finding speakers, sponsors, or even being a speaker yourself is something we would greatly appreciate. You can reach out to Raul at anant.us if that is something you're interested in. See, we are a part of a larger community, Data Community DC, and we do support all race, gender, religion, all sorts of walks of life are welcome here, and we ask that you guys respect the others. And Data Community DC is actually made up of a lot of other smaller communities. Some of those are listed here, you can see. You can check out their blog at datacommunitydc.org/blog. They also put on other events. The link for their events is listed there below as well. What we cover here, all things related to Cassandra. So Spark, Kafka are other two other technologies we tend to talk about as well. And in regards to Cassandra, it's everything. So protocol, how the nodes communicate together. And I mean, pretty much everything surrounding Cassandra. Hopefully we'll be covering things like Scala, Yugabyte, Cosmos, Amazon key spaces, and other things moving forward in the future. We've covered a lot of different topics here already. This is the point where if anyone is new, we like to ask them to speak up. I won't force anyone if no one wants to share their video or audio or anything like that. Which I don't see any new faces here, so we'll move on. Some general ground rules. If you have a question, please ask it. Sometimes the speakers have their own rules, so some speakers prefer you mention in the chat. Some are fine if you just unmute yourself and ask your question. We just ask that you be courteous and polite to others. It's also more of a discussion here, so if you have more in-depth knowledge on something, or you know maybe how to clarify a particular point that the speaker is going over, please feel free to speak up. Typically, the speakers will go over how they like questions to be handled once we pass the presentation over to them. Here at Anant, we cover real-time data and analytics. It's something we are heavily involved with. So generally, the technologies we use are Cassandra, Spark, and Kafka. So Cassandra is definitely part of our daily life. DataStax is also a sponsor, as well as George Washington University. We've had a little over a year, or I guess maybe more than a little over a year of COVID, but these events would typically have been held in person at George Washington University. Hopefully now that things seem to be going back to normal, we'll be able to get back to that. Although I live in Arizona, so I probably won't be joining you guys there, but I'll video in with you guys. Some of our sponsors are listed here, as mentioned before, DataStax and some of these others. And some organizational sponsors to Data Community DC as well. At this point in the introduction, we like to open the floor to anyone who has an announcement, jobs, meetups, hackathons, conferences, that sort of thing. And since we don't have anyone new, it doesn't seem like anyone's speaking up, we can go ahead and move on. Anant is hiring. We are looking for full-time or part-time positions, data platform operators, engineers, and architects, if that's something you'd be interested in. Don't hesitate to go to careers.anant.us for more details. Some upcoming events we have Data Engineers Lunch, which takes place on Mondays at noon Eastern. We'll be going over ACA actors for data processing on our next one. And as far as Cassandra topics, we have Cassandra ETL with Airflow and Spark. One topic is yet to be determined, and then we will be going over migrating PostgreSQL to Cassandra. All of our Cassandra lunches, at least starting with the 10th edition, are on Cassandra.Lunch playlist on YouTube. So if there are other topics you are interested in learning about, that is a great place to start. There is also a GitHub repo where there's descriptions and kind of a list of all the topics we've covered as well. Cassandra.Link is the best resource for all things Cassandra. It is curated by us here at Anant. So everything related to Cassandra, you can see here, there's Spark, Kafka, all sorts of things, and you can search through there. If you have any questions relating to something about Cassandra, this is a great resource to use. So definitely check that out. And without further ado, I will pass it off to our speaker for today, Obi, so he can take over and let us know.
All right. Okay. Yeah, we're good. Okay. So I'm Obi Anunachi, as I was previously introduced. I am an engineer at Anant, and today we're talking about Airflow and Cassandra for cluster management. This is sort of follow along from my last Cassandra lunch, which I think was like 48 or something, which was about Airflow and Cassandra, and we talked about the Cassandra operator, Cassandra hooks, and how they allow you to do things like send CQL statements to a Cassandra cluster in order to load data or query your data. And today we're talking about, when I say cluster management, I mean the sort of routine tasks that you would SSH into your Cassandra cluster maybe to do. Things like force garbage collection, get out your table stats, things like that, which you can use Airflow for instead via different operators that don't necessarily have anything specific to do with Cassandra. All right, so starting off again with our Airflow overview. It's a tool for scheduling workflows and automating them. Very good for ETL tasks, for machine learning models, anything that is repeated and can be automated. You write your workflows in Python, you define your dependencies, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can also schedule them or execute them by hand, force them to trigger specifically. And then it also monitors the progress of your tasks and allows you to collect and view logs. A bunch of different features, including Airflow 2.0, which has a distributed scheduler, as well as its own UI and APIs that you can interact with. DAGs, directed acyclic graphs, are your individual tasks and their dependencies. You can monitor them inside the Airflow UI, which will tell you what tasks have run, what tasks are queued, and it will also show you this sort of graph view where you can see your tasks, what their dependencies are, which ones have run, which ones are queued, when they're scheduled for, all that sort of stuff. And then also a history of previous runs, parts of your individual tasks, whether they succeeded or failed in the past, all that sort of stuff. And then Airflow also provides a bunch of different provider packages, which include operators, hooks, sensors, connectors for a bunch of external software that you might want to connect your Airflow to. The ones that we talked about last time were the specific Cassandra operators. But the ones that we're going to talk about this time are sort of more general, but we're going to be using them to interact with Cassandra, which are the Docker, the Bash operator, and the SSH provider. And then Airflow connections help you manage your connections to external systems. This is where you would have your SSH information for whatever machine you're trying to SSH into to run commands. This is where you would keep your Cassandra details if you are trying to run specific SQL queries on the cluster using the Cassandra hooks, like we discussed last time. Okay, so on to the meat of today's presentation. What we're talking about is Airflow operators that you can use with Cassandra that aren't just the Cassandra operator. Previously, we talked about the Cassandra operator. The Cassandra operator contains two different types of operators usable in Airflow, which are the table and the record sensor, which you can use to basically scan a table for existence or scan a table for particular records, and it will start your next task once the thing that the sensor is calibrated for is detected. We talked about the Cassandra hooks, which use the Cassandra connection, which just holds the data that you would use to connect to a Cassandra node. The Cassandra hook gives you access to all of the Python Cassandra driver functionality, because you can extract your session from the Cassandra hook, and it will store it for you and make it accessible in Python via Airflow. And you can use that to basically run any query or on that the Python driver can handle. So essentially, you don't have access to describe commands because those are CQLSH like extras, but you do have access to insert, to alter table, to all that sort of stuff. But today we're talking about other operators that might be useful to use with Cassandra. So the first one that I investigate is the Docker operator, because I usually run Cassandra in sort of Dockerized environments. But the Docker operator is more useful for bringing up new Docker containers in order to bring up new Docker containers based on an image that you can then run define commands on. So if you wanted to bring up new nodes in a Cassandra cluster, that's what you use the Docker operator for. Versus the others that we're going to talk about today are for actually running those auxiliary commands that you would usually say SSH into your Cassandra containers in order to be able to operate, or use the Docker exec to get yourself a shell to then run them on. So the bash operator is one of Airflow's main operators. The main two are Python operator, which you use to run Python callables like functions, and the other is bash operator, which you give a command or commands, and it will run them on local machine, or if you give it a different machine, which you can do via the SSH operator, you can connect to SSH and run commands on external machines. So the SSH operator combines with SSH hook, which actually handles the connection, and SSH connection, which stores the data for that connection in order to run commands on a machine that you have SSH access to. And the cluster management tasks that you might want to use Airflow to trigger are any sort of repeatable tasks that you could run on a Cassandra cluster that you might need to run on a schedule. So node tool commands especially, there are a huge number of node tool commands. They all do different things, but the main ones that you might want to say run regularly using Airflow scheduling or run in a DAG as a prelude to running other things are no tool flush, which flushes your in-memory data from your commit log in Cassandra to your disk in the form of SS tables. No tool compact, which performs compaction. It resolves copies and tombstones in your data. If you have, because SS tables are immutable, updates are written to the disk in new SS tables when you would say use no tool flush to do that. Compaction resolves the copies of those data, make sure that only the most recent one stays in your Cassandra cluster in order to save space. It resolves tombstones, so when you delete data or data has expired because you've given it a time to live, compaction will make sure that they're actually removed in order to save more space. And then it also consolidates your data into fewer SS table files rather than having a bunch of different ones which are written at different times. And while Cassandra's read and write processes do have a way to resolve data that's in multiple SS tables by selecting the most recent one, your reads will be faster if your data is properly compacted. And then no tool repair repairs data mismatches between nodes. So if you have written data to particular nodes in the cluster, no tool repair will make sure that it's sort of uniform across all replicas. And then other things you might want to do are change your configurations. You can use things like no tool disable auto compaction to set different configuration in your Cassandra cluster. Sorry about that. And then some other things that you might want to do are to do things like get statuses from various different node tool commands that you want to save into Airflow logs for easy access. If you use like node tool status, you can get the status of your various nodes, and that will be copied over into the Airflow logs where they're saved inside your Airflow scheduler and accessible via your Airflow UI. Actually, we do have more things to go over. So looking at the specific operator for Docker in Cassandra, you can give it an image or a tag. You can give it, well, you give it your Docker URL, which is the API host for your Docker daemon on your system. So you give it the specific machine and the location on that machine where the API is running, which you can set in your Docker configuration. And then Airflow will use that to bring up a new Docker container with the given image, which it can download from Docker Hub. So it will go download your image if it's not there, but it will mean that your Docker operator command will take longer because it has to go out and download the image. And then you can also give it various different kinds of certification if your Docker is secured. And you can give it, where's command? You can give it a command to be run in the container once it's up. If you were instead using the bash operator, if you theoretically had your stuff up in Docker containers all the same, you would use the docker exec command with the name of your container in order to run the bash command that you give your bash operator. And then output will still be put back into Airflow logs properly. And then if you're on a separate machine, you can SSH in. You can give it either a pre-built SSH hook, or you can give it an SSH connection ID, which will cause it to go and get the information about your connection to your SSH connection from the connections API, and use that to build a Cassandra hook, which would then be used to actually connect to the external machine and run the command that you give it. And then as for things that you might want to run using this method, There are lots of inbuilt Cassandra tools that are packaged with Cassandra. So obviously the main one is CQLSH, the CQL shell. Um, and it has several special commands which you can only use through this shell, and you can't use through, say, the Python Cassandra driver. There are node tool commands, of which there are a whole lot. But like I said, a bunch of the main ones, several of the main ones are flush, compact, force a compaction on the table, and then what was the last one I had on that list? Repair, which forces the manual repair process to start on the node. Um, but you can also do things like remove nodes. You could use the drain command to make a node stop accepting new writes and then flush all of its data to SS tables so that they wouldn't have any, no new data would come into the commit log, and you could potentially back up that data and close the node if you wanted. You can get statuses, status or info or table stats. All those things can give you information about your cluster. And then you can set configuration like disable gossip or any other sort of features that Cassandra has, which you might want to enable or disable in order to facilitate what you want to work on that Cassandra cluster with. And then there also are a bunch of like specific SS table tools. You can dump SS tables to, say, JSON or to other formats so that you can look at them. You could theoretically use this as well as Docker copy or SSH SCP to back up SS tables that you have on your machine. So one potential workflow would be flush, compact, SS table dump, and then back that up somewhere, possibly using Airflow S3 provider or something like that. And then you can also use it to run, if you say run every so often on your cluster, Cassandra stress tests using the tool that they provide. You could do something like turn off writes for your system, run the stress test, get the results, save them to your Airflow logs, and then and have that be a workflow. So while I did have a demo, the machine that I used is not currently connecting to Zoom properly. So instead, we'll sort of go through. No, this is the old one. So this one uses the Python operator and Cassandra hook in order to run a query. Just select all from test.users on a cluster. And the way that you would run, say, because this is for a Cassandra connection that's not shown in code because it's defined via the UI, but it connects to a Docker container running Cassandra and then executes this query on it. Whereas if you wanted to run some of our other commands, like one of the node tool commands, you would use the Airflow provider or the bash operator and run with Docker exec name of container and then the command, and it would run that and give you your results and put them back into your Airflow logs. But like I said, I cannot show that off because I'm having technical difficulties with the Linux machine. So we'll move into questions right away. And the way this works is that first, questions about anything mentioned during this presentation And then after that, time for general Cassandra queries or anything else that the Cassandra community would care to discuss. So right now we are opening it up for questions. You can unmute yourself and just ask, or you can put them in the chat. All right, if there are no questions about the presentation, any general Cassandra topics to discuss can be brought up now.
Hey, Toby. Can't tell if,
if
Richard or that's Stephanie maybe. I don't know, they're unmuted, but don't seem to be asking any questions.
Yeah, if there are no other questions, we can just end it here, give everyone their time back.
All right, thank you guys for coming in, and you can go ahead and stop the recording.